11:21 a.m. Don Tobias finished covering the grave with the last shovelful of dirt and realized that now he truly was alone. If you believe that 20 years of loyalty deserves to be honored, subscribe to Cuentos del Viejo Campo and turn on the notification bell. The Durango sun fell that November afternoon, the way it always falls in the Sierra, without asking permission, white and vertical over the cemetery of the San Isidro de las Flores ranch, which was no longer called that, since the Patron's children had decided to rename it something else that no one used, because the ranch had carried that name since before any of them were born. Don Aurelio Rivas Castellanos had died at 81, in his bed, with his eyes open and his hand on his chest. And the only thing he had said the night before, according to what Don Tobias recounted afterward, was, "Tomorrow check the spotted mare." That was how the Patron was. Even with his last breath, thinking about the horses. Don Tobias Fuentes was 54 years old, and had spent 20 of them working at the San Isidro ranch without ever having asked for more than what was his due, which was little. But it was his, and he kept it without complaint. He had arrived at 34 from Canatlan with empty hands and the recommendation of a compadre who no longer lived. And Don Aurelio had received him by telling him that if the horses accepted him, he too would accept him. The horses accepted him that same afternoon. Don Tobias had stayed. 2 decades of early mornings with the fire lit before anyone else woke. 2 decades of knowing by name every animal in the corral. Of knowing when a mare was about to foal just by looking into her eyes. Of carrying sacks when his back no longer responded the way it had at 30. And of not saying so because that is not something one says. Don Aurelio had seen all of it. And the little he had to give, he had given without announcement and without speeches, which was the only way Don Aurelio knew how to give things. But the Patron's children had not seen it. Because the Patron's children had been living in Monterrey for 15 years and returned to the ranch in December, if at all, to spend 3 days and go back with cheese and chorizos that Doña Fernanda, the eldest's wife, called the products of the countryside, with a voice that made the phrase sound like something picked up off the ground without bending too far. They arrived 4 days after the burial, in 2 new pickup trucks, with the licenciado Brambilla among them, who was the notary from Guadalupe, Victoria, and who had come with a folder under his arm, and with that expression of a man who already knows how the meeting is going to end before it begins. There were 3 children. Aurelio Jr., who was the eldest and the one who did the talking. Hortensia, who didn't talk but nodded at everything her brother said. And the youngest, Renato, who looked at the ranch like someone calculating square meters. Doña Fernanda came with the eldest and wore a dress that was not made for the ranch. Don Tobias received them in the courtyard of the main house with his hat in his hand, the way he had always received the Patron's children, which was with respect, but without servility, because Don Aurelio had told him once that respect that comes from fear is worth nothing, and the kind that comes from dignity is not negotiated. Aurelio Jr. was direct. "We're going to sell the ranch, Don Tobias. We're letting you know in advance so you can look for another place. You have until the end of the month to vacate the room." Don Tobias said nothing. He looked at the trucks. He looked at Licenciado Brambilla. He looked at Renato, who was already walking toward the corral without asking permission. "And the horses?" he asked. "They're sold with the ranch," said Aurelio Jr. Doña Fernanda added, without raising her voice, looking at the hacienda house with the expression of someone calculating the cost of demolition. "In this condition, we can't offer it to anyone as it is. We'll have to invest or tear it down." Don Tobias put his hat back on his head. He turned around, and he went to the corral to check on the horses, because that was what had to be done. And because as long as there were horses to check, he was not going to stand in a courtyard listening to how they were taking away 20 years of his life with the soft voice that people use when they think they are being considerate. Relampago was the oldest of the horses, a 16-year-old chestnut with a white mark on his chest that looked like a lightning bolt drawn by someone who didn't know how to draw well, but who had tried hard. Don Aurelio had bought him as a colt and given him to Don Tobias to break, and Don Tobias had broken him with 8 months of patience and without a single blow. And since then, Relampago recognized his footsteps from the far end of the pasture and would come at a trot, even when there was nothing to eat. That afternoon, when Don Tobias entered the corral, Relampago raised his head and came slowly, as if he knew something had changed and that the two of them were going to have to talk about it without words, which was the only way the two of them ever talked. Don Tobias put a hand on his neck and stood like that for a long while, with the Durango sun going down behind the hill and the smell of mesquite burning in some shack on the Ejido. "There it is," he said, without saying anything more. The next day, the usual routine began, because Don Tobias didn't know how to live any other way, and because the horses were not going to stop needing water and feed just because people had come from Monterrey to say that everything was being sold. That morning, like every morning for 20 years, he lit the fire before dawn, warmed the clay pot coffee on the brazier in the main house's kitchen, filled the buckets with water for the troughs, and distributed the feed in the mangers while the sky turned that burnt orange color that dawn has in the Durango Sierra when there are no clouds and the air is still and cold. Licenciado Brambilla passed through the corridor at 8 with the folder under his arm and greeted him with a tilt of the head that was the licenciado's way of not really greeting at all. "At what time can we go over the ranch inventory?" he asked. "Whenever you like," said Don Tobias. "The cattle papers are in the tack room. The patron kept them up to date." Brambilla nodded and kept walking. Don Tobias watched him walk away and knew, with the certainty that 20 years of knowing which people matter and which don't can give, that this man had everything already calculated, and that the folder he carried had not come to inform but to execute. 3 days passed in which the patron's children measured, counted, photographed with devices that never stopped beeping, and spoke among themselves with that speed of city people who confuse hurry with intelligence. Don Tobias continued with his routine. He continued checking on Relampago every afternoon. He continued lighting the fire before dawn, and he said nothing of what he was thinking, because what he was thinking was his own, and there was no one to say it to. It was on the afternoon of the 4th day that Don Tobias went to the tack room to look for the cord he needed to repair the pasture rope. And when he moved the tack chest to reach the back corner, the chest, which was heavy and made of dark wood, slid further than it should have, and behind it appeared an opening in the wall. A hollow in the adobe about 20 centimeters wide and 30 tall, sealed with a flat stone that fit perfectly. Don Tobias stood looking at the hollow. But that night, Don Tobias was going to read something that had been waiting for him for more than 12 years, hidden behind a flat stone in the wall of the tack room. He removed the stone. Inside was a small wooden box without a lock, the size of a book, with the lid slightly warped by the humidity of the years. He opened it. Inside there were 2 things, an envelope sealed with red wax and the name Don Tobias Fuentes written on the lid in the patron's handwriting, which was large and tight, and which Don Tobias recognized immediately because he had seen that handwriting in the ranch papers for 20 years. And beneath the envelope, folded in 4, the patron's leather notebook, the one Don Aurelio always called the Book of the True Accounts, and which Don Tobias had looked for many times after the patron's death without finding it. He opened the envelope first. It was a document with a notary's signature, but not Licenciado Brambilla's, rather an earlier one. The notary Villanueva from Canatlan, dated 12 years earlier. It said that Don Aurelio Rivas Castellanos, in full possession of his faculties and without pressure from anyone, was leaving in inheritance to Don Tobias Fuentes Aguirre the perpetual rights of use and habitation over the main house of the San Isidro de las Flores ranch, including the tack room, the main corral, and the small pasture that bordered the stream, in addition to all the horses that at the moment of his death were under Don Tobias's care, which at that moment were 7, counting Relampago. The document was signed by the patron, by the notary Villanueva, and by 2 witnesses whose names Don Tobias did not recognize. And it had an official seal that the notary Villanueva had stamped in blue ink in 3 different places on the paper. Don Tobias read the document twice. He folded it slowly. He put it back in the envelope. Then he opened the leather notebook. On the first page, in the patron's large, tight handwriting, it said, "Tobias, if you are reading this, it is because I am already gone. Keep this notebook because it has everything that the boys don't know and haven't wanted to know. If you hadn't found it, time would have found it. With God first." A second witness came that night. It was the son of the notary Villanueva, who lived in Guadalupe, Victoria itself, and to whom Don Tobias went the next day with the envelope in his hand. The young Villanueva read the document, looked for the copy in his father's registry, found it in the archive of year 12, and said to Don Tobias, "This is valid. My father was scrupulous. This is well done." The next morning, Aurelio Jr. was having breakfast in the main house dining room when Don Tobias came in and put the envelope on the table without hurry, without raising his voice. Aurelio Jr. looked at him. He took out the document. He read it. A long silence fell. Brambilla, who was in the corridor, looked in. They passed him the document. He read it. He consulted something in his folder. He said, "It's registered. It's in force." Renato said, "We didn't know this existed." Don Tobias looked at the 3 of them. "The patron knew what he was doing," he said, nothing more. Doña Fernanda set down her coffee. "One person alone can't manage a hacienda house and a pasture. It would be better if he signed something and they reach an agreement." Don Tobias looked at her for a moment. Then he said, calmly, with the voice of someone who has decided beforehand that this was going to be the only time he would say it, "Here we don't sell dignity for a roof, Señora. Here we earn it another way." No one responded. Aurelio Jr. folded the document. He gave it back to him. He looked at Brambilla. Brambilla shook his head, very slowly, which was the licenciado's way of saying that there was nothing to be done legally. Hortensia, who had not spoken during the entire breakfast, picked up her cup and went to the corridor. Renato looked at the pasture through the window for a moment and also left. They left that same afternoon before sunset in the 2 new pickup trucks. Brambilla left with them. No one said when they were going to return. The agitatario from next door, whose name was Don Encarnacion, and who had watched the trucks pass from his cornfield, came that night to ask Don Tobias how things had ended. Don Tobias served him clay pot coffee and told him. Don Encarnacion listened to it all and at the end said that the ejido had to be informed so they would know. That night the whole ejido knew. The next day, the whole town knew. When the January rains came down and the small pasture began to turn green again. The horses went out every afternoon to graze and returned to the corral with their backs shining from the new grass and their haunches heavy with the good season. Relampago always arrived last because he was the oldest and because he took the time he wanted. And Don Tobias waited for him at the gate with his hat on and his hands on the beam, watching how the orange Durango sun went down behind the Sierra, which was the same sun as always and fell in the same place as always and owed nothing to anyone. The leather notebook was kept in the tack room, in the same hollow in the wall, behind the same flat stone, because Don Tobias had decided that this was its place, and there was no need to move it. Some nights he took it out and read a page, not all of them, just one, because the patron had written a lot and there was no hurry. The wooden box was on the shelf of the room, next to the cross and the glass of water that Don Tobias always placed there out of habit, not out of mandate, which is the most honest way of doing the things one believes in. Sometimes inside someone who looks defeated, inside someone who has carried 20 years without asking for a receipt, there is a root so deep and so serious that neither time nor city children with their licenciados folders can pull it out. Silent loyalty does not seek witnesses, but witnesses appear. They always appear. And when they appear, they do so in the only way that matters, with signature, with seal, with date, on paper that does not fade. Who appeared in your life when no one was looking anymore? If this story touched something in your heart, leave your comment below and tell us from what state or what country you're watching us from. Subscribe to Cuentos del Viejo Campo and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single story. Share this story with someone who has given a lot without receiving anything, so they may know that life sometimes settles its own accounts. Until the next story. And they say in the Ejido of San Isidro de las Flores that when the sun falls and the horses return from the pasture, you can still see Don Tobias at the gate, waiting for the last one, as if time were in no hurry with him, because he is in no hurry with time either.